Yes, it's okay. Hello everyone. All right. Okay, hello everyone. Uh, welcome to the first talk in Mysticon, which is threat modeling in the SDLC. I have here with me a fellow SD speaker as well, Karan, and we will go through who we are uh, in the next slide. So let's move on to our introductions. So I will introduce myself first. So I'm Donovan. I currently work as a senior cybersecurity consultant at Thales. Thales is a French-based MNC, which does quite a lot of the other businesses. I'm on the cybersecurity side. For me, I pen test, I do consulting services, and in my time there, I have managed to create a cybersecurity card game called Defend the Breach. So if you see that little picture you have there is one of the cards in the card game where players, role play as a chief information security officer, a CISO, and they would have to, okay, it seems like there is no sound. Hmm. We have to,
Is the problem there is no sound?
yeah, that's, yeah,
I think the sound is coming through now.
yep.
Is the problem there is no sound?
Yeah, that's, yeah, the sound is coming through. So let me continue the introduction in a bit, right? Okay, so I have also created some content on VulnHub, basically deliberately vulnerable machines that you can use to train on your pen testing skills. Now I hand over to Karan to give his introduction.
Thank you, Donovan. I just wanted to say, yep, he closed that little box on the top, so that's good. Cool. A little bit about myself. Yeah, look, I'm the founder of WiseFox Security, a company that offers services in pen testing and DevSecOps space. I've been a pen tester for about 10 years now. I love doing web, mobile pen testing, and I also love providing DevSecOps consulting. When I'm not doing security, I'm a big soccer fan, and I love playing pool, and I love watching the sci-fi stuff. You can see that's my Twitter handle, and that is my YouTube channel where I do post content here and there. And yeah, so look, today we're going to talk about, as Donovan covered, threat modeling and all the things regarding security guardrails. And I really hope that you find this talk useful. And I will hand over to Donovan so he can kick this talk off. Back to you, Donovan.
Yeah, thank you so much, Karan. Without further ado, let's go on to the SDLC, right, which can stand for either software development lifecycle or systems development lifecycle. Doesn't really matter what, it depends on the kind of project that you're doing, because you could be developing software as part of a project, or you could be bringing in different pieces of software and hardware together to build a system, right? In a life cycle, there are several stages. Depending on where you read up what the SDLC is, it may come across as different names of these stages, but the concept is the same, right? So you have a planning and analysis step. You need to think about what the project goals are, the timelines and the resource requirements, what you need, whether you're going to buy software, develop software, etc. Then you move on into a design stage where you need to translate what the problems the business wants to solve into technical plans, right? Like, for example, if say I want to bring in a conveyor belt system, what does it mean technically, right? I'll probably need to buy a bunch of hardware systems, PLCs, there'll be software, there'll be a control station, there'll be this kind of stuff. Of course, with the design alone, it's not really enough to bring a solution to fruition. You need to implement it. And this is where, you have system integration works. You need to build basically uh, the various moving parts and bring them together, right? That's the implementation. Then testing and integration, you need to test these things to make sure they work in both a functional and non-functional way. And I think this is very, very important because often when we have projects like these, we remember the functional tests. We sometimes forget the non-functional tests like security testing, etc. So I'll just mention that. So that's a heads up to all those who believe that there's only functional tests required as part of the SDLC. And of course, once a system is being developed, being tested, integrated, and transferred to the operator to operate it, you need to maintain it, right, over the life cycle of the project. I won't talk too much about disposal here, but in short, this is the SDLC. I will now use the time to bring in what I have encountered based on my experiences in Singapore, and that is in the next slide, right? So in Singapore, thanks to the fact that we are a hub for lots of digital activity, the Cybersecurity Agency here has mandated that critical information infrastructure, which in short we call it CIIs, to perform several important security activities as part of the SDLC. So if you see the next slide, right, you will notice that, so next slide, you will notice that we have the SDLC. As I said, they can come in slightly different names on the left-hand column, but the idea is the same, right? You get some requirements, you plan, you acquire, then you do design development work, implementation assessment, and you notice that on the right-hand side, on the rightmost side, you see there's something called a risk management framework, right? So throughout a project life cycle, you need to manage risks of the business. And one of these important risks is cybersecurity risks. And how do you know what cybersecurity risks you encounter? Well, you conduct various types of cybersecurity assessments. If you look at the third column, you see the column where you have yellow and red rounded rectangles, as well as red bordered rounded rectangles. You notice that these are the areas where the Cybersecurity Agency in Singapore has mandated various security milestones to be done, right? Like for example, in the security planning and risk assessment, right from the start, you need to do something. What is this something magical? Well, you need to do some threat modeling. So the next slide. Why do we need to start security activity so early, right? Instead of just saying, oh, let's build the thing first and let's just call a bunch of pen testers to do a VAPT on the system. Well, the cost of security is important, and this is an important message to send to the businesses, right? To those who are in control of the purse strings of companies. The later you perform certain security activities, the more expensive it is. And how expensive? So you see that we have a chart here, and this shows the relative price of security. So security doesn't come cost-free. And we all know, since security is not a revenue generator for these projects, essentially it is an exercise in cost management. So the more effort you put in front to identify your security risks, design various mitigations, or put in place certain design principles to deal with these potential risks and to try to minimize them, the cheaper it will be when you go to the later stages of the project life cycle. The last thing you want is to implement a project, it works really well, and then when you realize that there are certain cybersecurity issues that pop up, you realize that you have to redo the whole design. That clearly is not what we are after. Now, but there's a little catch, right? So in the past, when we used to design projects, it used to be all physical, right? You know, you have physical servers, you have physical workstations, you bring all of these guys in, and then you start pulling network cables and you can see them. So if you do a physical site inspection, you know quite clearly what's where. Unfortunately, that's not the case today because we have great degrees of virtualization. We first started by virtualizing the OS themselves. That's why you have, hypervisors and virtual machines. And today, even if you work in the operational technology space, you will find some of these familiar. And that's because, well, the business wants to keep costs down. And you know that virtualizing the OS is quite inefficient. And so we decided that, okay, we should virtualize the other layers themselves and keep it there. So that's why you see today you have containers, you have then these containers that talk to one another. And how do they speak to one another? Well, you write all of these as code. infrastructure as code, terms you have heard before. In other words, pretty much everything that you have today has some form of abstraction. And with greater abstraction comes greater responsibility, for the very simple fact that it is not all that clear nowadays when systems are being deployed what exactly the threat surface is. Okay, the next slide. Now, I mentioned this just now, and as you can see, as the level of abstraction becomes more granular, meaning to say it becomes finer, you realize that the complexity increases. Why? Quite simply put, the more software you have, the more code you have, the more chances there are of a software level misconfiguration. Unfortunately, human error is prevalent in whatever we do. And at the end of the day, uh, we still don't have ChatGPT deploy entire infrastructure for us, right? And because of that, we need to understand better what our software is and how such software complexity also means that the threat actors that endanger our systems have increased complexity as well. Now that I've scared you quite thoroughly over the need for a certain threat model, let's actually talk about what a threat model is, right? So let's move on to the next slide. Yeah. So here, the whole idea behind threat modeling, at least in my book, right? It is not a simple one-dimensional exercise. There are many threat models out there today, and honestly, if you ask me how I would conduct a threat model, the first thing we will do is to sit down with the customer to understand what exactly we need at the various levels. So if you are familiar with how the military defines various levels of thinking, we have what we call the strategic level, the tactical level, as well as the operational level, right? And there are many different kinds of models that we can reference. For today's talk, since it's only an hour long, I'm just going to briefly talk about how one can combine two different models at different levels to give a good idea on our threat landscape, right? And the whole idea is that through the threat modeling exercise that we do, the better that you can describe these threats, in other words, who does what, where, to cause what impact, right? The more surgical your cyber countermeasures can be. The most important statement here is that the threat model that you define will influence pretty much all the subsequent downstream security activities. So it is essential that we get this right. Now, next slide. I mentioned that we start off with strike because it is a strategic model. And what I mean by strategic is that you get the opportunity to begin at a very high level, right? And in this very simple diagram that we have here, you begin by identification of the systems and subsystems, and then that's where the threat modeler will use a certain tool to map the data flow and interactions between these subsystems. If you're familiar with the history of Strike, Strike came from Microsoft, and Microsoft has very kindly created a tool to do this, which is the threat modeling tool, which is free of charge. Only pity is that it only runs on the Windows platform. But of course, a simple Windows machine can solve that, right? And if you cannot get a Windows machine, you can always borrow from someone else, right? And then, you can use a threat modeling tool to perform many of the important steps in step one, which is to identify your system subsystems, mapping the data flow, the interactions, and most importantly, identify the trust boundaries, right? What is trusted, what's less trusted. In some environments, you have very different degrees of trust. Like, for example, me having come from a defense background previously will tell you that there are different levels of trust, and they are very mindful of these because different levels of people would have different levels of security clearance as defined in their mandatory access clearance model, right? And then for each of the subsystems, you enumerate a strike matrix. And then what we mean by a strike matrix? Well, strike, for each of the properties you have in strike, they correspond to a certain security property. For that, I think I can leave you to look at the property of what each letter stands for. So for example, you have spoofing, tampering, repudiation, and then you can see that the security property that they tamper with, like the simplest one, for example, right? We all know denial of service, well, that affects availability. Whereas, if you have, say, a repudiation, that affects how you're able to audit, right? Whether somebody did or did not do a certain activity. Okay. Now, the important thing here is that Strike only provides you a high-level view. In other words, strike alone will not tell you how an attacker will perform a certain task, right? You will pretty much, by the end of a strike threat model, come up with something like, oh, an insider accesses a workstation, runs certain commands to perform, say, elevation of privilege, or maybe, say, perform reconnaissance against another system, right? To, perhaps to attempt to gain access to a more classified system. Right? That's where another threat model comes in useful, which is step 3. Now, we want to understand the how. Maybe go back to the previous slide. Yeah, that's step 3, right? For each of these subsystems, we enumerate the attack tactics. So here, attack, we refer to the MITRE attack framework. And where MITRE comes in really, really helpful is that it lists down at the very different stages of the cyber kill chain, right? Different steps you have. What are some of the tools, techniques, and procedures that the attacker would do, right? And then you will go through step 4. You will enumerate the applicable taxonomy of the techniques based on what you have in the strike model. You go through this a few times, and then you go to step 5. And that is where we want to lead into the next slide. So you see that this whole iteration process is helpful because it influences the downstream security activities. I mentioned that earlier. So what do I mean? Well, in the case of the red team, right? Basically, it could be your internal pen test team, a bunch of folks who would attempt to enumerate, to test certain attack scenarios. We can design our pen test around a scenario-based assessment as opposed to something just like a VAPT. You go through that, you tell this guy, go through OWASP SOC 10, and then you'll be there and done with, right? That we can go further. We will go through scenarios, we will set objectives, and we'll see if the attackers can achieve certain objectives. If they succeed, well, it means that your defenses are not sufficient, right? So what do you then need to do? You need to write certain detection rules. And I would like to mention another framework here, which is very useful because with offense comes defense as well. And MITRE, the same place where we got our attack framework, has also written the defense framework, which allows you to understand for each attacker TTP you have, what are the various mitigations and security controls you can put in place. So you have your security engineering teams writing rules, to detect these guys, prioritizing in various software that you have in a SOC, what alerts you should prioritize. And why? Because this can differ depending on your threat model. In an IT environment versus an OT environment, the threat model will be different. In an OT environment, for example, you have a power grid, right? Or maybe an aviation system. It is clear that availability matters because once availability is down, your system pretty much does not perform its intended function. For example, if the power grid goes down, we simply won't have the talk that we are having today, right? Whereas in the IT system, you see that clearly we are more concerned about the data, right? The confidentiality and the integrity of the data. So this is where the threat model will give you a clear picture on what you need to prioritize, right? Now, next slide. What you see is what you get, right? Because it is only through the threat model that you have done that shows you what are some of the cybersecurity risks that you need to mitigate, you need to address. Now, the unfortunate fact of life is that there is always too much to do, and there's never enough time to do every single cybersecurity action. And that's for a very simple reason, right? Because the threat landscape keeps on evolving. There'll always be new cyber threats, new CVs, software that gets deployed in your environment is found to be vulnerable to something. And often when you speak to your friends in the blue team, they will tell you that, hey, I'm overwhelmed. I have to do 1,000,001 things. There's so many different indicators I have to keep track of, but I need to know what I should do first, right? And I'll give you an example of a changing threat landscape in the next slide. Some years ago, we remember that there was something called COVID-19, right? I hope this is a distant memory. Unfortunately, in Singapore, the COVID-19 cases are coming back up, so it might become relevant again, right? But think about this example here. Imagine you have a power grid, and in the past, if you have power, it's a critical infrastructure, so you would typically make it a standalone system. If you want to adjust things in the power grid, You will get a contractor to go down to the site, perform a local login, and you manage these guys through physical security controls, right? You have access cards, you need to tap in to go into a protected facility. Now, unfortunately, when COVID-19 happened, right, a whole bunch of people, they were homesick, they missed their homes, and so they told their employers they will go back home and they'll, either work from home or never come back to work again. Either way, that's sad news for the employer because now the contractors that they rely on are not on site. So what did the business do? The business still had to continue to run, so they have to introduce connections, they had to introduce remote connectivity, and due to the nature of COVID-19, because it was fast, it was dynamic, the government was introducing lockdown rules faster than the businesses could react, and so the businesses had to come up with stopgap measures. They had to quickly design remote access mechanisms so they could continue enjoying the services of the contractors that they are now remote. Do you notice something from a cybersecurity perspective that has changed? If the answer is that the threat landscape has changed, you are absolutely right. From what we designed initially as a standalone system, it is now a connected system. And depending on what broker you use, it could be trying to funnel your traffic through a cloud provider, or it could be just you simply putting up a putting up, lease line with an internet provider and then opening TeamViewer, which is not really a good idea, just saying, right? You notice that the threat landscape has changed, the threat surface has increased, and, well, did they do a revised threat model of the system? We don't know, to be honest. So if you see, this is clearly a problem, right? And the next slide is absolutely important as a result. So the next slide. So keeping up with the pace, right? Next slide, yeah. As you can see, threat modeling is not something that you do once and then you say, oh, the threat model is done. Let's file the papers in a register somewhere and, access it only when the auditor comes, right? And why you don't do this is because you will still release new features. You will still do new things, right? Which is basically the next bullet point. And in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, you see that even in an OT environment, in an operational technology environment where you assume that people move slowly, people had to move because of the changing landscape, right? Now, how do you ensure that your latest release and new features have been appropriately modeled and that you have identified risks that you care about? And the reason for this will be made much, much clearer once I hand over to Karan, who will then explain from his DevSecOps perspective where things move much, much, much faster, right? How you keep up with that frenetic pace of change. And then the last point, how do you keep up with the fast pace of DevOps without being a roadblock? And this is the opportune time to hand over, right? To Karan, who will then bring in his DevSecOps hats, right? And move away from that slow world of OT to explain more on how we can threat model and make sure that security guys can keep up with the ever-changing pace of business.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Donovan. Yeah, I think it's great the points that you've covered. And yeah, I'll just for a bit of a recap, keeping up with the pace is super important. And the reason keeping up with the pace is super important is because most of the organizations that we deal with on day to day are adopting DevOps practices. So with the DevOps practices, the pace of releases that they're doing to their products is very, very rapid. That means some companies are doing, multiple releases per day. Some are doing few releases per week, but it varies from organization to organization, right? However, the number of features that you're introducing and the number of code that you are introducing is not becoming less, right? Therefore, it is super important that every change that you're making, that you still have some sort of methodology that allows you to threat model and provide some sort of assurance across those releases or features that you're deploying to the products, right? So there are some of the things or some of the tips that I would love to share with you from my personal experience as a DevSecOps consultant or a DevSecOps engineer. So I will share those tips with you in the upcoming slides. Right. So Here, when you're dealing with DevOps teams, and this is the state of a security consultant or security team who are waiting for their invitations to threat modeling sessions. And that may or may not happen depending on how mature your organization is and your security consultants are waiting like this. Now, how can we change the situation, right? How can we enable still rapid pace, but with a proper security assurance in place? So that means we as security teams, we are not acting as a roadblock for our DevOps teams or for our development teams. Well, let's look at what sort of solutions do we have in place. First thing first, that I highly recommend, and the things that I've seen from my personal experience that are working in lots and lots of organizations is called security guardrails. Now, this is what your typical guardrail sort of looks like. And, taking this methodology, how can we apply this in the security realm? So in the simplest form, like if you really want to understand security guardrails in like simplest forms, it's just some security controls that are defined by your security team, or you as a team, you have defined some guardrails or security controls that prevents any sort of deviations from an expected behavior. I can give you a quick example. Let's say you've got a platform that enables encryption at rest. And that's a by default control that platform allows you to do. As an example, in a cloud environment, let's say it's an S3 bucket, which encrypts data at rest by default. Now, that's a guardrail. That means any object that's stored inside that S3 bucket will be encrypted at rest, right? So you don't really have to worry about enabling encryption at rest because it's enabled by default. Now, that's a guardrail that is now, is set up by AWS, but in the past, that was actually set by your security team. So they would enable that at, perhaps through some sort of bucket policies that any data that would store in the S3 needs to be encrypted. So you could, use that as an example. Now, by enabling guardrails, you are still allowing your development teams or your DevOps teams to operate at a rapid pace. However, they are not compromising with security because your security guardrails are keeping them within the boundary that is defined within the guardrails. Also, as an application security teams or security teams in general, you will be, it is highly important or it is highly recommended that your security guardrails are automated. That means you're not sitting there reviewing every single release that the teams are making to their products. Now, imagine when you work in an organization that is doing 20, 30 releases per day. How many security resourcing do you have which can actually manually check those releases and ensure that, there are no security vulnerabilities or additional risks that those releases would introduce for your organization? Therefore, it is super important that the guardrails that you define, they are automated. And last but not least, because once those guardrails are baked into your development team's processes, it is really, really hard for them to really bypass or ignore those security controls. Therefore, it is super important that you automate your security guardrails as well as you bake those security guardrails into your development team's processes, because that way it becomes as part of their delivery and it's not sort of seen as an additional step that they have to sort of perform. Okay, moving on. So I was talking about a guardrail, right? So from experience, what I like to do is every time you define a security guardrail, you need to have an objective. Like, what's the objective of that security guardrail? Now, at a high level, let's take an example. Let's say as a team, as a security team, you want to define a guardrail that prevents critical and high vulnerabilities from going into production environment. Now, this is a little bit vague guardrail. However, it is a guardrail, right? So this is the objective of your guardrail. Now, the example security controls that you can introduce to achieve that objective, let's say you're using CI/CD pipelines. Well, you would have to enable, or you have to embed security tooling in your CI/CD pipelines, and then you have to tune that security tooling to detect security vulnerabilities, right? So that's the whole purpose of why you will have tooling in the first place in the CI/CD pipelines. So if you have security tooling in your CI/CD pipelines, you can enable, or you can set these tools to fail on critical and high severity security vulnerabilities. So what these tools can help, so every time these tools pick up critical or high severity vulnerabilities, they would fail the CI/CD pipelines. They would fail the build. That means the teams will have to fix those vulnerabilities before they can actually deploy that artifact in production. So therefore, you are still achieving the objective that you've defined, right? But at the same time, we as a security teams, we are not sitting there reviewing each and every release, each and every build that is actually, being built through that CI/CD pipeline. We have created such a methodology, and we have enabled security tooling as part of our CI/CD. However, we are not clicking through and manually identifying vulnerabilities. Our tooling is doing that for us. And that's why it is super important when you have security guardrails, they are automated. And similarly, because we want our development teams to move still deploy at a faster pace, any vulnerability that is below critical and high, such as medium and low severity vulnerabilities, wouldn't fail their pipeline or wouldn't block them from releasing that product. Now, you can obviously, this is just an example, you can obviously change that severity depending on the type of asset that you're dealing with, because that whole risk profile will be fully dependent on the type of organization that you're dealing with. Moving on. Now, just a few things that I want to talk about the guardrails, because they're super important, is your guardrails are going to differ from asset to asset. Because let's say you are working with a web application, so the security guardrails that you will define, so guardrails being the security controls, just to reiterate, so those security guardrails are going to differ from a web application and when, say, you are developing a mobile application, right? So the guardrails that you will define for web will differ from the ones that you will define for a mobile application. And then again, they will differ for, let's say, for infrastructure as code. So, that's the thing that you have to keep in mind. Another thing is, once you have defined the guardrails as a squad, let's say I'm a DevOps team and we have defined some sort of security guardrails, you need to get those security guardrails approved by your security consultants and engineers, so they can give you a stamp that the guardrails that you've defined, they align with the company's security policies and stuff, right? And then again, just to reiterate, any changes after you've defined the guardrails and they're approved by the security teams, so any change that you're making, if the change falls within the approved security guardrails, you probably wouldn't need to make any changes to, let's say, to your existing threat modeling, because the change sort of falls within the approved guardrails. Therefore, maybe an update to your existing threat model may not be necessary. At the same time, however, let's say you have fully changed the way you handle authentication for your web application. Now, that change falls outside of your predefined security guardrails. Therefore, to reassess the risk, you have to make changes to your existing threat model. That means you probably have to reevaluate, how that change sort of affects that existing asset. Therefore, that triggers an update to your existing threat model. Now, Donovan talked about threat modeling in various scenarios. However, I would highly recommend, just adding to Donovan what just he mentioned, these are some of the tools that you can leverage when you are conducting threat model. So this is, there are some commercial toolings in there, and there are some open source toolings as well. So I think, again, depending on your needs, you may have to pick one or the other. But yeah, so highly recommend, to begin with, you can perhaps leverage the Microsoft Threat Model or OWASP Threat Dragon, because they are both free. But again, as Donovan said, you perhaps, need to check which one runs on which sort of platform. Some additional tips that I want to give you, again, from experience. So this is specifically regarding threat modeling. When you conduct threat modeling, you need to make sure whether you are a security team or you are a DevOps team, like who needs threat modeling, you need to make sure that for that threat modeling session, you invite the right people for that session. If you definitely need someone, from the architect team, you definitely need someone from the security team, you probably need people from the engineering team or from your DevOps team, and the people who are actually going to build that product down the line, they need to be part of that threat modeling session. So don't waste anyone's time by inviting maybe just security people or by just having the DevOps people doing threat modeling. Let's say if they're fully trained, that's great. However, if they don't know how to conduct threat model, then perhaps, you're pretty much wasting that time. Second thing, again, from experience, you probably want to limit the threat modeling session under an hour. Anything that goes beyond an hour mark is probably not acceptable in many organizations. However, there could be many reasons why, you perhaps your session may go over 1 hour, but it's highly recommended that, that your threat modeling session are below 1 hour. And if you're making iterative changes to your existing threat model, then perhaps it would take even less than that, like 30 minutes or 20 or 30 minutes or so, because you want to make sure that, any change that you're making, you perhaps want to quickly make those little updates to threat modeling if those changes are falling outside of your defined guardrails. And another thing that I want to mention is, and this is super important as well, so before you rock up to any threat modeling session, just do a little bit of a prep work. That means maybe go through your architectural design, maybe look at the high-level solution design, maybe look at that threat modeling template that your security team may have put up on the Confluence page, just to get a little bit comfortable around that exercise. Because if you just rock up to a session and you have no background, you're probably going to spend 15, 20 minutes just to sort of catch up on that session, like what's really going on. Another thing that I want to mention is you probably want to, as a security team, you probably want to have a proper, well-established threat modeling template that you use, and that template should be standardized across the whole organization. You don't want various teams to create their own threat modeling templates, because that's going to lose all of its consistency. Because let's say you get auditing done on your internal security processes and whatnot, and the artifacts that you're going to produce may not match. So therefore, there is no consistency when it comes to threat modeling. So it is super important that when you conduct threat modeling as a security team, you probably want to have a well-established threat modeling template, and you need to make that templates available to your wider organization. And no matter where you post it, use Confluence or, whatever other intranet sites that you might have. Other thing is that I quickly want to mention is, because more and more organizations that we deal with, they always say that they don't have enough security resources to be able to do threat modeling. And as I was saying, because of the rapid pace of DevOps, there is a huge demand. The companies still want to do threat modeling. However, there is not enough resourcing to be able to do that. So again, from my DevSecOps experience, I would highly recommend that, firstly, you kick off a security champions initiative, and you should set a goal for your security champions to be able to do threat modeling. So in order for you to train your security champions to do that, obviously you have to provide them specific training around threat modeling. There are lots of paid and unpaid resources out there that can help your security champions to be really good at doing threat modeling. But as a security team, you really have to put that effort as well. Another thing is, you need to obviously talk to your security champions, because what's going to happen with this, but once you have enabled or implemented a security champions program, this is going to help firstly with your resourcing gaps and resourcing challenges, because now you have enough resources who can do threat modeling. Right? So there is no longer an excuse here that says, oh, we don't have security resources. Well, you can go to your security champions to get some sort of threat modeling done. Another thing that I quickly want to mention is, this also helps is, champions know like the security champions who are part of their own teams, they know what is really going on within their squads, so they can actually help security teams identify where there may be some help needed to conduct a threat modeling session, or maybe so your security champions are proactive and then they will actually help the squad that needs threat modeling. So that's why it is another good opportunity for you to have a security champions initiative and champions trained on threat modeling. And again, last but not least, since, because we are the one who kick off Security Champions Initiative, we as security team, we need to be there for our security champions when they need our help. That means they may need additional help when they have conducted a threat modeling session and they probably want you to check their work. So you need to still help them. Don't just, say, oh no, you got it. Help them when they ask for your help. This is all from me. And at a recap level, I just want to quickly talk about, what Donovan covered, like what a stride threat model is. And just again, just to sort of cover it off, S stands for spoofing, T stands for tampering, R stands for repudiation, I stands for information disclosure, D stands for denial of service, and E stands for elevation of privileges. So this is what makes up a stride threat model, like these different domains of cybersecurity risks. And like how do you identify these risks and threats in a given system or an application? So this is at a high level what a stride threat model really covers. Unfortunately, this wasn't a session where we could have conducted one threat model for you. However, there are lots of other resources out there, and I'm really hoping that, whatever Donovan and I have covered as part of this talk, it is somewhat useful for you, and hopefully we've shared some tips that you can implement in your day-to-day. Over to Donovan.
All right. Now that I think we have gone through what we have on both our ends, we are open to questions from the audience, right? So I think if you're listening on Twitch or on YouTube, and if you have questions, please post them there. We will wait for some time for those questions. Mhm. Right. And I guess Melvin, you can help us read to check to see if there are questions there, right? While we
Uh,
wait for the questions, I think we can
Can you guys hear
also,
me?
yeah, we can hear you loud and clear now.
Okay, amazing. Okay, yeah, thank you for the amazing talk. Let me see the chat. Uh, yeah, if there are any questions, please put your questions in the chat, and those two amazing guys will answer your questions. So let me share.
Yeah. Yes.